Alexander Hayes never believed in family secrets. He'd spent 15 years in Philadelphia teaching classical literature to children of merchants and lawyers, deliberately distancing himself from the Virginia plantation that bore his family name. Convinced that whatever darkness existed in his lineage had been buried with the old generation. But on September 3rd, 1868, when the telegram arrived announcing his uncle's death, Alexander felt the first whisper of something wrong. Not grief exactly, but a premonition that the past was about to reach forward and pull him back into its grip. 3 weeks later, kneeling on the dusty floor of his uncle's study, prying up a loose floorboard with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, he lifted out a leather-bound journal that would shatter everything he thought he understood about his family, about education, about the peculiar institution that had defined the South for 2 centuries. The first page contained 73 names, each followed by notations that shouldn't exist. Grammar exercises, conjugations, translations of Virgil and Cicero and Horace. 73 enslaved people, taught Latin in systematic secret between 1821 and 1828, in violation of every law and social convention of the antebellum South. But it was the journal's final entry that made Alexander's blood run cold. Dated April 17, 1828, the words trailed off mid-sentence into an ink stain that looked like it had been made by a hand, jerking suddenly away from the page, as if interrupted by something violent. Whatever had happened that spring had been catastrophic enough that no one spoke of it again for 40 years. Until now. Before we descend into the buried truth of what happened at Willowbrook Plantation, if you're captivated by hidden histories that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past, subscribe to this channel and activate notifications. And tell us in the comments, have you ever discovered a family secret that changed your understanding of your own history? Let's uncover this mystery together. The journey from Philadelphia to Willowbrook took Alexander 3 days by train and coach, each mile carrying him deeper into a landscape he'd spent years trying to forget. Virginia in September was still heavy with summer heat, the air thick and drowsy, tobacco fields stretching golden brown under an endless sky. Alexander watched the countryside roll past the coach window and felt memory stirring despite his resistance. His childhood summers here before the war, running through these same fields, unaware that everything around him was built on suffering. He'd left in 1853 at age 17 to attend university in Pennsylvania, and he'd found reasons to avoid returning ever since. His father had died in 1843. His mother remarried and moved to Baltimore, and his Uncle Thomas had managed the estate alone for 25 years. They'd exchanged letters occasionally, polite updates about weather and health, but nothing of substance. Alexander had preferred it that way. The telegram from the lawyer, Josiah Vance, had been brief and formal. Thomas Hayes, deceased September 1st. Heart failure. As sole heir, your presence required to settle estate. Vance and Associates, Fairhaven, Virginia. No condolences, no details, just legal necessity compressed into 30 words. Alexander had packed a single trunk, arranged a substitute teacher for his classes, and departed within 2 days, driven more by obligation than grief. He barely remembered his uncle, a tall, thin man with sad eyes and ink-stained fingers, who'd seemed old even when Alexander was young. Fairhaven was the kind of small Virginia town that looked like it had been sleeping since before the war and hadn't quite woken up yet. Main Street held a general store, a church, a modest courthouse, and the law office of Josiah Vance, whose brass nameplate was the shiniest thing in sight. Vance himself was a compact, efficient man in his 50s, with silver hair and the carefully neutral expression of someone who'd learned to keep his opinions private. "Mr. Hayes," Vance said, shaking Alexander's hand with professional firmness. "Thank you for coming so promptly. I trust the journey wasn't too difficult." "Long but manageable," Alexander replied. "I appreciate your handling matters in my absence." Vance gestured to a chair and opened a folder on his desk. "The estate is straightforward. 400 acres, the main house, various outbuildings. No debts. Your uncle lived modestly, kept to himself. "The property is yours free and clear, though I'll be frank. It's not worth what it was before the war. Land values have collapsed, and without—" He paused delicately. "Without the previous labor system, farming on that scale is no longer profitable. Most planters in this area have sold out or subdivided their holdings." "I'm not planning to farm it," Alexander said. "I'll need to assess the property, determine what makes sense. Perhaps sell it or rent it out." "Of course." Vance pulled out a key ring. "I've had the house maintained since your uncle's death. His personal effects are all in place. I should mention—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Your uncle was an unusual man, Mr. Hayes. Brilliant, everyone said, but increasingly reclusive in his final years. He lived alone, kept no servants after the war ended, rarely came to town. Some found him eccentric. He spent most of his time reading and writing, corresponded with scholars in Richmond and Washington. Classical literature, I understand, Latin and Greek. He went to Harvard," Alexander said. "Class of 1820, I believe. My father said he was always bookish." "Indeed." Vance's expression suggested there was more he wanted to say, but thought better of it. "In any case, the house is ready for your inspection. I've arranged for a boy to drive you out this afternoon if that suits you." Willowbrook revealed itself gradually as the hired wagon crested the final hill. First the peaked roof of the main house appearing above the tree line, then the white columns of the front portico, and finally the full sweep of the property. Fields gone to seed. Empty slave quarters collapsing slowly back into the earth, outbuildings with sagging roofs and broken windows. The place had the hollow feeling of something abandoned, not just physically, but spiritually, as if even the land was trying to forget what it had been. The house itself was a two-story colonial structure, elegant in its proportions, but showing decades of minimal maintenance. White paint peeled from the columns, the front steps sagged, weeds grew between the porch boards. The boy who'd driven the wagon, a local farmer's son, no more than 15, helped unload Alexander's trunk and departed quickly, as if reluctant to linger. "They say the place is haunted, sir," he offered as he climbed back onto the wagon. "Say old Mr. Hayes never slept peaceful." Alexander said nothing to that, just watched the wagon disappear down the long drive, then turned to face his inheritance. The front door was unlocked. Inside, dust hung in the air like suspended time, visible in the bars of afternoon light slanting through shuttered windows. The entrance hall stretched back to a staircase, rooms opening off to either side, parlor, dining room, library. Everything was precisely arranged, furniture covered with dust sheets, but the air was stale and close, as if the house had been holding its breath. Alexander walked through slowly, pulling back sheets to reveal furniture from his grandfather's era. Heavy, dark, imposing pieces that spoke of wealth and tradition. Nothing had been updated in decades. It was like stepping into 1840 and finding it perfectly preserved. His uncle's presence was most evident in the library, floor-to-ceiling shelves crammed with books, more books stacked on tables and chairs, creating narrow pathways through the room. Alexander examined the spines. Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Ethics, complete works of Tacitus and Plutarch, volumes of Roman poetry, Greek drama, philosophical treatises in Latin, French, and German. His uncle had accumulated a serious scholar's library, the kind of collection that belonged in a university, not a remote Virginia plantation. Upstairs, the bedrooms were simpler. Guest rooms stood empty and unused. His uncle's bedroom was monastic, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair. The man had clearly lived without comfort or decoration, as if he'd been punishing himself for something. But the study, the room at the end of the upstairs hall facing east, was different. This was where Thomas Hayes had spent his final years, and the space showed evidence of obsessive occupation. The desk was piled with papers, correspondence, manuscripts, pages of translations in his uncle's neat hand. The shelves held more classical texts, many with bookmarks and marginal notes. A worn armchair sat by the window, positioned to catch morning light. This room felt lived in, worked in, agonized in. Alexander spent his first evening sorting through the obvious papers on the desk. Letters from other scholars discussing points of Latin grammar or debating interpretations of Virgil. A half-finished translation of one of Seneca's essays on moral philosophy. Notes for what looked like an article on the influence of Stoicism on early Christian thought. His uncle had been a serious, perhaps even brilliant classical scholar, working in complete isolation. Why? Why retreat from the academic world to this remote plantation to live alone and pursue learning that no one would ever see? He slept poorly that first night in one of the guest bedrooms, waking repeatedly to the unfamiliar sounds of the old house settling, wind in the eaves, the distant call of an owl. When dawn finally broke, he rose exhausted and returned to the study, determined to organize his uncle's papers systematically. That's when he began really examining the desk itself. It was a massive piece of furniture, mahogany, with multiple drawers and compartments. Alexander worked through them methodically, pens and ink, blank paper, sealing wax, stamps, the usual contents of a scholar's desk. But when he pulled out the bottom drawer on the right side, which had stuck slightly, he noticed that the drawer seemed shallower than it should be, given the external dimensions of the desk. He pressed on the bottom, and it gave slightly. A false bottom. He removed the drawer completely, set it aside, and reached into the empty space. His fingers found the edge of a board that had been cut to fit precisely, but not nailed down. He pried it up carefully. Beneath, in the hollow space between the drawer and the actual bottom of the desk, was a leather-bound journal tied with a faded ribbon. Alexander lifted it out with hands that had begun to shake without him quite understanding why. The leather was worn smooth with handling, the ribbon brittle. He carried it to the window where morning light was streaming in, and carefully untied the ribbon. The journal opened to reveal his uncle's handwriting, younger and steadier than the writing Alexander had seen in the recent correspondence, but unmistakably the same hand. The first page bore only a date and a warning. March 15, 1821. Private record. For my eyes only. What follows must never be discovered. I write this knowing that if anyone finds it, the consequences will be catastrophic not just for me, but for everyone involved. Yet I must document this. History should know, even if history cannot know now. Perhaps someday, when the world is different, someone will read this and understand what we attempted here. Alexander turned the page, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't yet articulate. What followed was a list that seemed innocuous at first glance, but became increasingly impossible as he read. Marcus Johnson, age 34, field worker. Began studies March 20th. Completed first declensions April 10th. Exceptional aptitude for grammar. Diana, age 27, house servant. Began studies March 26th. Memorizes poetry with single reading. Natural gift for language. Benjamin, age 19, blacksmith's apprentice. Began studies March 23rd. Struggles with abstract concepts but shows remarkable determination. The list continued. 73 names in total, spanning 7 pages. Beside each name, his uncle had noted age, occupation on the plantation, date they began studies, and comments on their progress. And every entry referenced declensions, conjugations, translations, Latin authors, Caesar, Virgil, Horace, Ovid. Alexander sat down heavily in his uncle's chair, the journal open before him, and tried to process what he was reading. In 1821, in Virginia, it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. The law was explicit. Any person who assembled slaves for the purpose of teaching them reading or writing would be subject to fines and imprisonment. The rationale was equally explicit. Literacy led to unrest, to ideas of freedom, to organized resistance. The entire social structure of slavery depended on keeping enslaved populations ignorant, isolated, unable to access the written word that might wake them to their own oppression. And yet here was documentary evidence that his uncle Thomas, fresh from Harvard at age 23, had systematically taught 73 enslaved people classical Latin. Not just basic literacy, which would have been dangerous enough, but one of the most complex languages ever developed, requiring years of study to master, the language of Caesar and Cicero and Virgil, the foundation of European high culture and intellectual tradition. Why? Why Latin? Why risk everything for this specific, seemingly impractical form of education? Alexander turned to the next page, dated March 25, 1821, and found the beginning of his uncle's narrative. Today was our fourth lesson. We meet in the tobacco barn after full dark, when father has retired and the overseers have finished their rounds. I bring a single candle and we keep our voices low. There are 17 in attendance now. I've been spreading word carefully through Marcus and Diana, who select only those they trust absolutely. The secret must be kept at all costs. They arrive exhausted from a full day's labor, but the moment we begin, their exhaustion vanishes. I've never seen such focused attention, such hunger to learn. At Harvard, half my classmates slept through lectures on Cicero. Here, field workers who've been harvesting tobacco for 12 hours lean forward to catch every word about Latin verb conjugations. Marcus asked me tonight why I chose Latin. It's a fair question, one I've anticipated. My answer was strategic. Latin is old, dead, religiously associated. If anyone overhears fragments of our lessons, they'll assume Catholic prayers, religious instruction, which, while unusual for Virginia, is not illegal. Latin carries no contemporary political danger. No one fears Virgil's eclogues the way they would fear abolitionist newspapers or pamphlets about freedom. But I didn't tell him the deeper reason. Latin is precisely valuable because it is difficult, because it demands disciplined thought, because it trains the mind to analyze complex grammatical structures and abstract relationships. Once a mind learns to think systematically in Latin, it can think systematically about anything. Law, politics, philosophy, the very nature of freedom and bondage. I'm not teaching them Latin. I'm teaching them that their minds are as powerful as any white man's. I'm teaching them that everything they've been told about natural inferiority is a lie. Alexander stopped reading and stood up, walking to the window. Outside, morning sun illuminated the abandoned fields of Willowbrook, golden light spilling across land that had once been worked by hundreds of enslaved people. He tried to imagine it as it had been in 1821, his uncle, barely older than Alexander himself, sneaking out after dark with a candle and a Latin grammar book, conducting secret lessons in a tobacco barn with people who legally weren't even supposed to know their own names. The audacity of it was staggering. The danger was absolute. If caught, his uncle would have faced fines, possibly imprisonment, certain social ostracism, but the enslaved people who attended those lessons would have faced far worse. Whipping, branding, sale away from family, possibly death, if the lessons were interpreted as preparation for rebellion. And yet, 17 people came to that first lesson, and according to the journal, more would follow. Alexander returned to the desk and continued reading. The journal entries were dated sporadically, sometimes weekly, sometimes with gaps of a month or more, but they built a detailed picture of what his uncle called the experiment, a systematic, ambitious program of classical education conducted entirely in secret, in stolen hours, with people who had no right to learn and a teacher who had no right to teach them. April 1821. We've completed basic declensions and moved to simple sentences. Diana has a gift for syntax that astonishes me. She understands grammatical relationships instinctively, can conjugate verbs she's only heard once. Marcus is slower but more methodical, building each concept on the previous one like a mason laying stones. Benjamin struggles with the abstract nature of Latin but refuses to give up. His determination alone is remarkable. May 1821. 32 students now. We've had to split into 2 groups, meeting on different nights. I'm teaching them Caesar's Gallic Wars, which provides both language instruction and historical context. Last night, after we read about Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Diana asked me what it means to cross a point of no return. We talked for an hour about decisions that can't be undone, about committing fully to a course of action despite knowing the risks. I realized as we spoke that I was no longer teaching. We were discussing, debating, engaging in genuine Socratic dialogue. These are not students in any conventional sense. They are my intellectual equals, trapped in a system that denies them even the possibility of equality. June 1821. My father is growing suspicious. He commented yesterday that the field workers seem different lately, that they carry themselves strangely. He couldn't articulate what had changed, but he senses something. I must be more careful. We've moved our lessons to different locations. Sometimes the woods beyond the south field, sometimes the basement of this house when my parents are away visiting relatives in Richmond. The risk increases with every session, but stopping is unthinkable. The students have made it clear they want to continue regardless of danger. As Marcus said to me last week, we've been living with danger our whole lives. This is the first time the danger might actually lead to something worth having. July 1821. 57 students now. The lessons have taken on a life of their own. I provide texts and guidance, but increasingly they're teaching each other, discussing texts among themselves between our formal sessions. Diana told me that she and 3 others have been meeting in the laundry house on Sunday afternoons to practice translation. They're working through Virgil's eclogues, pastoral poetry about shepherds and the simple life. The irony of enslaved field workers reading pastoral poetry is not lost on any of us. August 1821. We read Seneca last night, his essay on anger and how it corrupts the soul. The discussion afterward was more sophisticated than any I experienced at Harvard. Marcus observed that Seneca himself had been advisor to Nero, had participated in imperial power even while writing about virtue and restraint, and asked whether philosophical wisdom means anything if it doesn't translate to moral action. I had no good answer. The question keeps me awake nights. The journal continued through 1821 and into 1822, documenting the expansion and deepening of the secret education. Alexander read with growing wonder about enslaved people debating Stoic philosophy, discussing the fall of the Roman Republic, translating Horace's odes about the brevity of life and the importance of living with integrity. His uncle's pride in their accomplishments was evident in every entry, but so was his constant anxiety about discovery. And then, in April 1823, disaster struck. April 8th, 1823. My world is collapsing. Father knows something. I don't know how much, but he knows. Yesterday I was walking to the barn for an evening lesson, and I saw him watching from the study window. He said nothing then, but this morning at breakfast he asked me very deliberately what I'd been doing in the barn so late at night. I said I'd been checking on a sick horse. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw doubt in his eyes. Suspicion, but also something else. Fear. He's afraid of what I might be doing, afraid of what it might mean for the family, for the property, for his position in society. I told the students tonight that we must suspend lessons for at least a month. Let suspicion die down. They accepted this reluctantly but understood the necessity. April 15th, 1823. Catastrophe. Marcus was found in the stable reading a book I'd lent him, Ovid's Metamorphoses. Father saw him with it, recognized Latin text immediately, seized the book, and confronted me in my study that same night. I tried to lie. Said Marcus must have stolen it. Couldn't possibly read it. Father didn't believe me but wanted to believe me. I could see that conflict in his face. He needs to believe his son isn't betraying everything the family stands for. But he can't ignore what he saw. This morning Marcus was whipped in the yard. 20 lashes. I was forced to watch. Father's overseer, a man named Garrett, who's always frightened me with his casual cruelty, administered the punishment methodically, without anger, but without mercy either. Marcus made no sound. He met my eyes once, and I saw no accusation there, only a terrible understanding. This is the cost, his expression said. We both knew it might come. April 22nd, 1823. I haven't slept properly in a week. Every time I close my eyes, I see Marcus's back, The blood, the systematic violence. I want to stop everything, burn the books, pretend it never happened. But Diana came to me 3 days after Marcus was whipped. She brought a message from him and the others. They want to continue. They understand the risks better than I do. They've lived with violence their entire lives, she said. The whipping was terrible, but not unfamiliar. What I'm offering them, what we're building together, is something no whipping can take away. Knowledge, she said, lives in the mind where no one can reach it. Even if they're beaten, sold, killed, the time they spent thinking freely, learning, discussing philosophy and poetry, that time existed. It was real. No one can make it not have happened. Her courage shames me. I don't know if I'm brave enough to continue, but I'm too much a coward to tell them no. The journal showed that the lessons did continue, more carefully than before. His uncle moved them entirely to nighttime sessions in the woods, kept the groups smaller, spaced the meetings further apart. His father's suspicion never entirely faded, but without concrete proof, he took no further action. Marcus recovered from the whipping and returned to the lessons. The group, which had briefly scattered in fear, gradually reconvened. But something had changed. They all understood now that this wasn't an intellectual game, that the stakes were real, that the knowledge they were pursuing might cost them everything. And yet they persisted. Through 1823 and 1824 and into 1825, the lessons continued. Alexander read entry after entry documenting their progress, their increasingly sophisticated discussions, their hunger for more texts, more knowledge, more access to the vast world of ideas that had been deliberately kept from them. November 1824. We read Tacitus tonight, his history of imperial Rome and the corruption of absolute power. The parallels to our own society were so obvious that no one needed to state them explicitly. We discussed how tyranny corrupts both tyrant and subject, how systems of oppression damage everyone they touch, how complicity in evil becomes normalized over generations. Benjamin asked me whether I thought future historians would write about slavery the way Tacitus wrote about Roman tyranny, as something monstrous but also strangely banal, woven into the fabric of daily life until people couldn't imagine any other way. I said I hoped so, that I believed someday slavery would end and be viewed with the same horror we now view Roman gladiatorial games. Marcus said quietly that he wouldn't live to see that day, but perhaps his children's children might. The sadness in his voice haunts me still. March 1825. 73 students now. This is as large as the group can safely grow. Some have been studying with me for 4 years now and can read Latin as fluently as any Harvard graduate. They're working through Plutarch's Lives, biographical studies of great Greek and Roman figures. The discussions these texts provoke are remarkable. We debate the nature of leadership, the relationship between individual virtue and political power, whether history is shaped more by great individuals or by larger social forces. These are conversations I could have with professors at any university, yet they're happening in secret in the Virginia woods, with people who legally aren't even allowed to own the clothes they wear. July 1825. Diana asked me yesterday why we never discuss escape. It's true. In 4 years of lessons, we've never once talked about running away, about the Underground Railroad, about practical strategies for achieving freedom. I realized I've been avoiding the topic deliberately, afraid of where it might lead, afraid of being accused of inciting rebellion. But she said that's not what they want from me. They have their own networks, their own sources of information about escape routes and safe houses. What they want from these lessons is something different, proof that their minds are their own, that they can think and reason and debate with the same sophistication as any white scholar, that the entire intellectual foundation of slavery is built on lies. If they run and are caught, they'll be beaten or killed. But what we're doing here, she said, no one can catch. It exists in their minds forever. Alexander had to stop reading again. His hands were shaking, and he realized he'd been holding his breath. The portrait his uncle painted was so far from anything he'd been taught about slavery, about enslaved people, about the entire structure of Southern society. He'd grown up hearing that enslaved people were naturally suited for physical labor, but incapable of complex thought. That education would be wasted on them, that they lacked the intellectual capacity for abstract reasoning. Every element of his childhood education had reinforced the idea that slavery, while perhaps unfortunate, reflected natural hierarchies. And here was proof, written in his uncle's careful hand, that it had all been lies. 73 people, denied every advantage, working exhausted after 12-hour days, meeting in secret with the threat of violent punishment hanging over them, had not only learned Latin, but had mastered it, had used it to engage in philosophical debates that would have impressed scholars anywhere in the world. He looked out the study window at the fields of Willowbrook and tried to imagine them as they'd been in 1825, worked by people who could quote Virgil, who debated Tacitus, who understood grammatical structures so complex that most educated white people struggled with them. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. But Alexander knew there were more pages to read, and he knew the journal ended abruptly in April 1828. Whatever had happened in those 3 years between the triumphant expansion of 1825 and the sudden end in 1828 was still ahead of him in the narrative. He took a deep breath and continued reading. January 1826. My father's health is failing. He's bedridden now most days, his heart weak, his mind sometimes confused. He's become paranoid about the plantation, convinced something is wrong, that the workers are acting strangely. He's not wrong, but he can't identify what has changed. They hold themselves differently now, the ones who've been studying with me. There's a quiet dignity in how they move, how they speak, how they meet white people's eyes. They haven't become rebellious or insubordinate. They're too smart for that, too aware of the danger. But they've stopped performing certain kinds of deference, stopped pretending to be less intelligent than they are. It's subtle, almost invisible unless you're looking for it, but my father senses it somehow, and it terrifies him. His whole world depends on maintaining the fiction of natural hierarchy, and he can feel that fiction cracking. June 1826. A disturbing development. My father has written to his cousin in South Carolina, a rice planter named Gerard Ashwell, inviting him to come help manage Willowbrook. My father is too ill to oversee the property himself, and he doesn't trust me. That much is clear. He's never said so explicitly, but I see it in how he watches me, how he questions my decisions. Ashwell is expected to arrive in early 1827. I remember him from childhood visits. A hard man, quick to anger, absolutely convinced of the rightness of slavery and the necessity of harsh discipline. If he comes here, if he starts watching everyone closely, our lessons will become nearly impossible to continue. I don't know what to do. After 5 years, after everything we've built, the idea of stopping now feels like betrayal. But continuing under Ashwell's scrutiny might be suicide. December 1826. My father died yesterday. Heart failure, as the doctor predicted. I should feel grief, but mostly I feel relief, which makes me despise myself. His last words to me were a warning. Watch them carefully, Thomas. They're planning something, I know it. He died believing his slaves were conspiring against him, never knowing that what they were actually doing was studying Roman poetry. The funeral is tomorrow. Gerard Ashwell sent a telegram saying he'll arrive in March as planned to help me establish proper order on the plantation. The language of his telegram made my skin crawl. March 1827. Gerard Ashwell arrived today. He's worse than I remembered. Brutal, suspicious, intelligent in a cold, calculating way. He spent his first afternoon walking the property, inspecting everything, assessing what he called the stock, as if they were cattle. He told me over dinner that he'd heard my father had grown lax in his final years, that discipline needed to be reimposed. He's already identified several workers he considers insolent and recommended they be whipped or sold as examples. I managed to talk him out of immediate action, but I don't know how long I can moderate his impulses. The lessons are suspended indefinitely. It's too dangerous. May 1827. Living with Ashwell is unbearable. He watches everything, questions everyone, rules through fear and punishment. Last week he had a field hand named Joseph whipped for talking back to an overseer. The man had merely asked a clarifying question about work assignments, but Ashwell interpreted it as insubordination. 15 lashes. I couldn't stop it. I'm technically master here, but Ashwell has a forceful personality and absolute confidence in his methods. He treats me like a naive boy who doesn't understand how to manage property. The worst part is that he's not just cruel, he's observant. He's noticed the same thing my father did, that something about the workers seems different from other plantations he's managed. He hasn't figured out what it is, but he's watching, always watching. July 1827. Managed 1 lesson in 2 months. We met deep in the woods at midnight, just 15 of us speaking in whispers. I brought no candle, worked only by moonlight. Diana told me the others are frustrated, desperate to continue studying. They've been reviewing materials on their own, sharing knowledge in fragments during work, but they miss the structured lessons, the discussions, the communal nature of learning together. But I don't see how we can continue safely while Ashwell is here. He's proposed that he take a permanent position managing the plantation with a share of the profits. I'm trying to find ways to refuse without causing a complete rupture, but he's not a man who accepts refusal easily. October 1827. Something remarkable happened. Marcus approached me yesterday, the first direct communication we've had in months, with a proposal. The group has been discussing it among themselves and they've reached consensus. They want to create something permanent, a record of what they've learned. Not for themselves, they understand that would be too dangerous, but for the future. They want to translate something meaningful from Latin to English, something that captures what these years have meant to them. They want physical proof that they existed as educated, thinking people. Even if that proof can't be revealed for decades or generations, they're willing to take the risk. This entry made Alexander sit forward, his attention suddenly sharp. A translation. His uncle had mentioned something about a manuscript in his final entry. This must be what he meant. The journal continued with his uncle's agonizing over the request. Creating a written document was physical evidence, proof of the illegal education that could destroy them all. But he eventually agreed, moved by their determination to leave something behind for history. November 1827. We've chosen the text. After much discussion, they selected Seneca's essay, On the Shortness of Life. It's appropriate in ways that break my heart. A meditation on how people waste their lives in servitude to others' expectations, never living for themselves, never choosing their own path. The essay argues that life is long enough if you use it wisely, but most people squander their time serving masters, accumulating wealth, pursuing empty pleasures. We'll divide the text into sections, with different students translating different parts, then come together to unify the translation. It will take months, maybe longer. Every moment we work on it increases the danger. January 1828. The translation is progressing. They work in small groups of 2 or 3, meeting briefly during any stolen moment. Sundays, early mornings, late nights. Each group takes a section of the essay, translates it from memory with minimal access to the original Latin text. Then they pass their sections to Diana, who's acting as chief editor, standardizing the language and checking accuracy. My role is minimal, occasionally consulting on difficult grammatical constructions or obscure vocabulary, but the work is fundamentally theirs. When this is finished, it will represent the collective intellectual achievement of 23 people. Not all 73 are participating, some are too frightened or don't want the risk of written evidence, but 23 have committed fully to the project. March 1828. The translation is nearly complete. Diana has compiled all the sections into a unified whole, 30 pages written in her careful hand, with the Latin text on one side of each page and their English translation facing it. I've reviewed it for accuracy, and it's extraordinary. Not just technically proficient, but genuinely insightful. Their translation captures nuances of Seneca's thought that many professional scholars miss. When this is done, I'll hide it with this journal. Perhaps someday, when slavery is finally ended and people can acknowledge this history without destroying lives, someone will find it and understand what these people achieved against impossible odds. April 2nd, 1828. Ashwell is asking questions. He stopped me yesterday and asked very deliberately whether I'd noticed anyone acting strangely, whether I'd seen workers gathering in unusual places, whether anyone had access to books or papers. I played ignorant, but my hands were shaking. He knows something. I don't know what or how much, but he suspects. Marcus warned me 3 days ago that Ashwell has been questioning people, asking about my habits, where I go, what I do. Someone must have seen something, said something, even if innocently. The translation is complete. I need to hide it immediately and tell everyone to stop all activities, any hint of education or reading. The danger has become acute. April 10th, 1828. Living in daily fear now. Ashwell watches me constantly. I've hidden the translation manuscript with this journal beneath the floorboard, but having physical evidence makes every moment terrifying. I should destroy it, but I can't. It represents too much, means too much. 23 people poured their minds and hearts into that translation, working for months, taking enormous risks because they wanted to prove to history that they existed as thinking, educated human beings. To destroy it would be to erase them, to pretend it never happened, to let slavery win even in memory. I won't do it. I'll keep it hidden, keep it safe, until some distant future when the truth can be acknowledged. April 17th, 1828. It's over. Ashwell knows everything. I don't know how, but he knows. This afternoon I saw him speaking with my father's old valet, asking questions, and the valet was pointing toward the woods where we used to hold lessons. Then tonight, just an hour ago, one of the younger workers, a boy named Samuel who never attended lessons, approached Ashwell's overseer and mentioned having seen candles in the woods some months ago, people gathering at night. The boy meant nothing by it, was just making conversation, but Ashwell heard and understood. I'm writing this now quickly because I hear footsteps on the stairs and I believe Ashwell is coming. Whatever happens next, this journal should survive as testament. 73 enslaved people learned Latin on this plantation between 1821 and 1828. They studied Virgil and Cicero and Seneca and Tacitus. They debated philosophy and politics and history with sophistication that would have impressed scholars at any university. They translated a classical text about freedom while themselves enslaved. They proved beyond any doubt that human intellect recognizes no chains, that the entire intellectual foundation of slavery is built on lies and maintained through deliberate ignorance. Whatever happens to them or to me, that truth existed. It was real. No one can make it not have happened. I should have protected them better. I should have. The entry ended there, mid-sentence, the ink smeared. The remaining pages of the journal were blank. Alexander sat frozen in his uncle's chair, the journal open before him, and felt the weight of 40 years of silence pressing down on him. What had happened next? Had Ashwell confronted his uncle? Had the secret been exposed? The journal gave no answers, only that abrupt ending that felt like a door slamming shut. He spent the rest of the morning searching the study methodically, looking for any other documents, any continuation of the story. He found nothing. The journal had been hidden beneath the floorboard alone, no translation manuscript with it. Whatever had happened to the 30 pages they'd worked so hard to create remained a mystery. The plantation records, which Alexander had reviewed with Josiah Vance the day before, showed no unusual events in April 1828. No sales, no runaways, no legal proceedings. Just routine notations about planting schedules and expenses. But the silence itself felt deliberate, like something had been carefully erased from the official record. Alexander decided he needed more information. The next morning he rode into Fairhaven and went to the county records office. The clerk was an elderly man named Joseph Patterson, who'd worked there for over 40 years and remembered everything. "Looking for information about your family?" Patterson asked, pulling down dusty ledgers at Alexander's request. "Going back 40 years, you said? 1828? "Yes. I'm trying to trace what happened to some of the plantation workers around that time." Patterson gave him a sharp look. "Curious thing to be researching. Most planters' families prefer not to dig into those details." But he opened the ledger anyway, running his finger down columns of recorded sales and transfers. "What months, specifically?" "April and May, 1828. Patterson flipped through pages, then stopped. His finger traced a long list of transactions, all dated between April 18th and May 15th, 1828, all from Willowbrook Plantation. "Huh," he said quietly. "That's unusual." "What is?" "Your grandfather, well, your uncle by then, I suppose after your grandfather died in 26, sold off a large number of workers that spring. 73, looks like, spread across about a month. That's a substantial portion of a plantation's labor force. Usually, you only see sales like that when an estate is failing or being dissolved." 73, the exact number from the journal. "Do the records show who they were sold to?" Alexander asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Different buyers, that's the other unusual part. Usually when you're selling off workers, you try to keep the sales local, minimize transportation costs, but these went all over: Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, North Carolina. Deliberate dispersal, looks like. Someone went to considerable trouble to scatter these particular people across multiple states. Is there any indication why?" Patterson shrugged. "Records don't show motive, just transactions." "But," he hesitated, then seemed to decide something. "There was talk in town that spring. Just rumors, you understand, nothing official. People said something had happened at Willowbrook, some kind of trouble with the slaves. Some said they'd been planning to run. Others said there'd been some kind of uprising that was put down. But then no one was killed. No one was publicly punished, just these sales over a few weeks, and then nothing. Like whatever it was got handled quietly, family style." Alexander felt sick. The sales were handled by whom? Patterson consulted the ledger. Gerard Ashwell, acting as agent for the estate. He signed all the transaction records. Alexander spent the next several days in the county records office, copying down every detail of those 73 sales. The names matched the ones in his uncle's journal: Marcus, Diana, Benjamin, all the others. Each one sold to a different buyer, families deliberately separated, people scattered across the South with systematic precision. Ashwell had dismantled the entire educated community his uncle had created, broken it apart, and distributed the pieces so they could never reconvene, never share what they'd learned, never pose any future threat. But why hadn't he exposed the secret publicly? Why handle it quietly instead of making an example through legal prosecution? Alexander found a partial answer to that question in a letter tucked into one of his uncle's books, a volume of Cicero's De Officiis. The letter was dated December 1867, less than a year before his uncle's death, written in his uncle's older hand but still legible. "To whoever inherits this house and finds these hidden documents, I've carried the weight of April 17th, 1828 for 40 years now." I was 29 years old then, convinced I was doing noble work, believing secret education could help undermine slavery from within. I was a fool. Not because education itself was foolish. Those 73 people proved themselves more capable than any students I knew at Harvard. But because I underestimated how violently the system would protect itself when threatened. Gerard Ashwell discovered everything that night. He came to my study with 2 overseers, and he held the translation manuscript in his hands. He'd found it that afternoon, hidden beneath the floorboard. Apparently one of the house servants had noticed a loose board, mentioned it innocently, and Ashwell investigated. He read enough to understand what it was. He gave me a choice. A devil's bargain, he called it. He could expose everything publicly, prosecute me under Virginia law, bring charges that would destroy my family's name and result in severe public punishment for everyone involved. Under the slave codes, Teaching slaves to read could result in whipping, branding, even execution, if authorities decided it was preparation for rebellion. 73 people would suffer spectacularly, publicly, as examples to anyone else who might consider similar actions. Or, Ashwell said, I could remain silent while he handled the situation privately. He would sell off everyone who'd participated in the lessons, scatter them across multiple states to ensure they couldn't reunite or spread their knowledge. He would destroy all physical evidence, and he would tell the remaining workers at Willowbrook that there had been a conspiracy, that the sold workers had been planning violence, and only the master's mercy had spared them from worse punishment. This would serve as both threat and warning. Step out of line and you'll be torn from everything you know. In exchange, I would deed him 40% ownership of Willowbrook, give him full management authority, and never speak of what had happened. My silence would purchase their survival, even if that survival meant separation and loss. I chose silence. God forgive me, I chose silence. I told myself I was protecting them, that private sale was better than public execution, that separation was preferable to death. But the truth is, I was protecting myself as much as them. I couldn't bear the thought of public trial, of facing my Harvard colleagues and Richmond society knowing what I'd done, of bringing shame on my family's name. My cowardice wore the mask of mercy. Over the following month, Ashwell methodically sold every person who'd attended the lessons. He consulted my journal to identify them, used my own documentation to destroy what I'd built. He made me present for every sale, forced me to watch as each wagon departed carrying people I'd taught, people I'd promised dignity and knowledge to. Diana was sold to a rice planter in South Carolina. Marcus went to a cotton plantation in Georgia. Benjamin was sent to Tennessee. All 73 gone, families separated, years of learning scattered like leaves. The workers who remained, those who'd never participated in the lessons, were gathered and told a lie. There had been a plot, Ashwell said, a conspiracy to murder the masters and burn the house. The ringleaders had been identified and removed. This was the consequence of stepping above your station, of forgetting your place. Let it be a lesson. The translation manuscript was burned. I watched Ashwell feed it to the fire page by page, 30 pages of careful translation, months of collective work, the product of 23 brilliant minds reduced to ash in 15 minutes. He kept only my journal, he said, as insurance that I would never speak of this. If I ever tried to tell the truth, he would produce the journal as evidence and bring charges himself. I lived under that threat for 13 years, until 1840, when I finally had enough money to buy Ashwell out. I offered him a substantial sum to leave Willowbrook and never return. He took it and went back to South Carolina. I never saw him again. But the guilt remained. I tried to track down some of the 73 in the years after, but it was impossible. By the time slavery ended in 1865, they would have been elderly or dead, scattered across states, likely with different names and no documentation. I failed them completely. I kept the journal because I couldn't destroy the only evidence that they existed, that their achievement was real. They studied Latin on this plantation. They debated Cicero and Seneca. They proved that human minds cannot be enslaved. And I failed to protect them. I don't ask for forgiveness. I document this only so that someone someday might acknowledge what those 73 people accomplished. They deserved freedom and instead received separation and silence. The very least I can do is ensure their story survives, even if I cannot. Thomas Hayes, Jr., December 1867. The letter was signed with a shaky hand. Alexander set it down and noticed there were more pages beneath, other documents in his uncle's hand. He lifted them carefully. One was a complete list of all 73 names with the dates and locations they were sold to. His uncle had documented every sale, kept meticulous records of where each person went. Alexander recognized it as both an act of memory and an act of penance. His uncle forcing himself to remember each person, each place, each loss. The final page was something different. At the top, in his uncle's handwriting, was written, "All I could save below were 5 lines in Latin, written in a different hand, graceful, careful lettering that Alexander assumed was Diana's. Non est ad astra mollis aeteris via. There is no easy way from the earth to the stars. Nemo potes personam diuferre. No man can wear a mask for long. Tempus edax rerum time. Devourer of all things dum spero. While I breathe, I hope no laetet bastardes carborundorum. Don't let the bastards grind you down." Below the Latin in English in the same hand, we existed, we thought, we learned. We debated freedom while enslaved. No one can erase this truth, no matter how hard they try. To anyone who finds this, remember us. Remember that we were human, intelligent, deserving of dignity and education and freedom. We didn't receive those things in our lives, but we seized them anyway in stolen hours. That time was real. That achievement was real. We were real. Diana, Marcus, Benjamin, and all 73. April 1828. The note was signed with 23 names, each in a different hand. They'd all contributed, even knowing the danger. This was their testament, their proof of existence. Alexander sat in his uncle's study as afternoon light faded, holding these fragile papers that represented the only surviving evidence of an extraordinary secret, and understood that he now carried a responsibility he'd never asked for. His uncle had kept the silence for 40 years, paralyzed by guilt and fear and Ashwell's threats. But Ashwell was long dead. The plantation system was destroyed. Slavery was over. The reasons for silence had evaporated. The truth could finally be told. But told to whom? Who would believe it? And even if they did, what difference would it make now, 40 years later, with all the participants likely dead or scattered beyond tracing? Alexander spent the next week searching for answers to those questions. He wrote letters to historical societies, to churches in the cities where the 73 had been sold, to anyone who might have records of enslaved people from that era. Most responses were discouraging. Record-keeping had been minimal, many documents had been destroyed during the war, people had moved or changed names after emancipation. Tracing individuals was nearly impossible. But one letter brought hope. Reverend Samuel Collins of Nashville wrote back in January 1869. He had church records dating to the 1840s, and yes, he had record of a Benjamin who had taken the surname Hayes after emancipation. A common practice, taking the former master's name as a way of establishing legal identity. This Benjamin Hayes had been a respected member of the church until his death in 1866. He'd been known as an educated man, unusually learned for someone his age who had been enslaved. How he'd acquired his education, no one knew, though the Reverend remembered Benjamin saying something cryptic once. "I was taught by a good teacher a long time ago, in a place I try not to remember." 2 of Benjamin's children still lived in Nashville. The Reverend provided their names and address. In March 1869, Alexander traveled to Nashville. The city was still recovering from the war, rebuilding, transforming itself from a Confederate stronghold to something new. He found the address Reverend Collins had provided, a modest house on the edge of the colored section of town. 2 women answered his knock. Sisters, he learned, both in their 30s. Charlotte and Rachel Hayes, daughters of Benjamin. They were understandably suspicious of a white man from Virginia, asking questions about their father. Alexander showed them his uncle's journal. They read it in silence, passing pages back and forth, and he watched their expressions change from suspicion to shock to something like wonder. When they finished, Charlotte looked up with tears in her eyes. "Our father never spoke about his time in Virginia," she said quietly. "He was sold away when he was 19, said he'd been separated from his family, but he wouldn't discuss details, said the past was better left alone. But sometimes," she paused, "sometimes he would say things in another language. Just a few phrases, always the same ones. We never knew what language it was." "Latin," Alexander said. He knew Latin. Rachel's voice was awed. How? Alexander explained everything. The secret lessons, the systematic education, the 73 students, the translation project, the catastrophic end in April 1828 when everyone was sold and scattered. He showed them his uncle's notes documenting their father's progress, his determination, his intelligence. He showed them Diana's testament with Benjamin's signature. The sisters sat in silence for a long moment. Then Charlotte spoke. So that's why he always told us education was the most important thing. He insisted we learn to read and write, even when it was difficult, even when there were no good schools for colored children. He said our minds belonged to us, and no one could take them away if we filled them with knowledge. We thought he was just being philosophical. We didn't know he was speaking from experience. He studied Cicero, Alexander said, and Virgil and Seneca. My uncle's notes say he was one of the most determined students. Rachel was crying now. And then they sold him away for it, took him from his family, sent him here, all because he wanted to learn. Yes, but he survived, Charlotte said fiercely. He survived and he raised us, and he made sure we got education even when it was hard. He didn't let them destroy him. Over the following months, Alexander continued his research. He found 3 more of the 73, a woman named Hannah, who'd ended up in North Carolina, a man named James in Georgia, and another woman named Sarah, who'd made her way to Philadelphia after emancipation. All of them had been young students in my uncle's lessons. All of them remembered. Hannah was in her 70s when Alexander found her, living with her grandchildren in a small house outside of Charlotte. She wept when he showed her the journal, recognizing her own name among the 73. I thought we'd all been forgotten, she said. After we were sold and scattered, I thought no one would ever know what we did. I thought it would die with us. You translated Seneca, Alexander said. My uncle wrote that you were brilliant. Diana was the brilliant one, Hannah said. She could memorize whole passages after hearing them once. The rest of us just worked hard, but it was wonderful, those lessons. For a few hours each week, we weren't slaves. We were students, scholars, people whose thoughts mattered. It was the only time in my life I felt truly human. What happened after you were sold? Hannah's expression darkened. I was sent to a rice plantation in South Carolina. Terrible place. They worked us in water up to our knees and the heat was unbearable. I tried to forget everything I'd learned. It was too painful to remember. But I couldn't forget. Not entirely. Sometimes at night I'd recite Latin declensions in my head, just to prove to myself I'd really learned them, that it hadn't all been a dream. After emancipation, I came here, started over, built a life. But I never told anyone about the lessons. Who would believe it? Alexander spent months documenting these stories, interviewing the few survivors and descendants he could find, slowly building a picture of what had happened to the 73 after they were scattered. Most had disappeared into the anonymity of slavery, their stories lost. But a few had survived, had raised families, had passed on their love of learning, even if they couldn't explain where it came from. In December 1869, Alexander published a book. He titled it The Hidden Scholars, A Secret History of Education and Resistance in Antebellum Virginia. It contained his uncle's journal, the testimonies of survivors and descendants, and his own analysis of what the story meant for understanding both slavery and human resilience. The book was largely ignored. A few academic journals reviewed it, mostly skeptically. The idea that enslaved people had studied Latin seemed implausible to many scholars, too extraordinary to believe. Some critics accused Alexander of fabricating the journal to make a political point. Others suggested his uncle had been mentally ill, that the journal was a fantasy. But a few people understood. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and former slave who had taught himself to read against enormous odds, wrote to Alexander, "Your uncle's students achieved what I always knew was possible. They proved that no chains can bind the human mind. Their story should be told and retold until everyone understands that slavery's greatest crime was not physical bondage, but the deliberate stifling of human potential." Alexander continued his research for the rest of his life. He never returned to teaching in Philadelphia, instead devoting himself to uncovering and documenting the stories of the 73 and others like them. Enslaved people who had learned to read despite the law, who had educated themselves and each other in secret, who had proved through their very existence that the entire intellectual justification for slavery was built on lies. He died in 1892, at age 66, having spent 23 years documenting secret education in the antebellum South. His work was largely forgotten for decades after his death, dismissed as fringe history, too focused on exceptions rather than typical experiences. But in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, historians began rediscovering Alexander's research. They found his book, found his notes and correspondence, found the original journal he'd preserved. And they realized that what had seemed like an extraordinary exception was actually one example of a much broader phenomenon. Secret education, clandestine schools, enslaved people teaching each other despite the law, creating underground networks of knowledge and literacy that history had failed to acknowledge. The Journal of Thomas Hayes, Jr. is now preserved in the archives of Howard University. Diana's Testament, with its 23 signatures, hangs in the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. The story of the 73 who studied Latin at Willowbrook Plantation is taught in universities as an example of resistance through education, of human dignity asserting itself against systematic oppression. But for 40 years, that story was silence. For 40 years, the only evidence existed in a leather journal hidden beneath a floorboard. A testament written by people who knew they might never be remembered, but refused to let their achievement vanish entirely. They were right to insist on that testament. They existed, they learned, they thought freely even while their bodies were bound. And no one could take that away from them, not even by taking everything else.